Hey everyone, this is the Making Strides Podcast, Episode 5. Today, Adam and I lay down the basic fundamentals for progressing your running. Whether you're a new, injured, or experienced runner, this episode covers how to effectively and safely progress towards your goals. We provide valuable insight into the basic rules for increasing your running frequency, duration, and intensity throughout a running program. Enjoy! Welcome to Making Strides, a podcast aimed at empowering and educating runners. Our goal is to help decipher misinformation in the running world that can lead runners off their path to progress. With an evidence-guided approach, this podcast aims to give runners the resources they need to foster healthy, lifelong running from track to trail. I'm AJ Cohen.
And I'm Adam Schwerdt. Let's make some strides.
Hey Adam, how's it going? We got episode 5 going here. We're going to talk about a return to running and just running progression in general. How you doing?
Doing good. It's a good Saturday. How's yours?
Good. Yeah, it's 4th of July. We both have basically no plans, but we're being good stewards of society right now because I think it's actually pretty responsible to not have any plans right now with the whole kind of political and just biopsychosocial landscape in general.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So anyway, let's just talk first about this may not appeal to a whole ton of our audience because I'm pretty sure that everybody who's listening to this podcast is in some way, shape, or form a runner or working with runners. But I think it's really good information and it lays some ground rules and fundamental concepts that are going to translate through to the rest of our talk. So if somebody is not a runner at all, and then they just get out of bed one morning and they're like, I want to start running. I'm going to become a distance runner. We're going to talk about that progression first. So and then we can just start with this random starting question. And I can ask you, what are some of the most important factors or like advice? If this person's asking you for advice, what's the most important advice that you could give to this person starting out running in general?
Man, I think that the starting point has to be some sort of baseline fitness prior to even running. Mm-hmm. Running is very demanding on the body, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, and in fact, probably a good thing for all of our muscles, tendons, cartilage, bones, all the above. But people like to think of it as any day of the week, any time in their life that they can just like walk out the door and go for a run when they haven't, as like their starting point when they haven't done anything, for the last several months or something, assuming the context of the new runner. So I think, a starting point is to just get some baseline fitness, do a little bit of strength training and a whole lot of walking, as that's really the closest thing we have outside of maybe like a stair stepper or something. Mm-hmm. But yeah, just having that baseline fitness is where it's got to start.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think, getting a history about where they might be currently, but also what have they done in the past in terms of like sports and stuff like that. What do you want to see in somebody's history who maybe wants to start running that might put them in a better or worse kind of situation for starting running?
I think soccer players have the best kind of knack for picking it up. I feel like in college and high school, we had several who might be kind of dual athletes, and man, they would just step on the track or the cross country course and just they weren't necessarily the best one out there, but man, they would hold their own like nobody else just the first day they step on, and I mean largely that's just a lot of carryover from the sport of running, or the sport of soccer involves so much running, speed and endurance that just carries over super well.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's great. I mean, anybody who's who's got a history of loading their body axially, multi-directionally. I think that's all really, really great. And, if somebody doesn't have that type of history, that's totally fine. We just have to approach it a little bit differently, maybe be a little bit more conservative. I probably have not had the most responsible progressions starting running in my past, but what's, I think, saved me from like extreme failure and extreme injury is the fact that I was a competitive gymnast for almost a decade. And then through high school and college, I was a wrestler, and I was just running like a ton for the sport of wrestling. And so, I was never really a runner per se until I actually decided to start running way later, but I had a lot of running under my belt. Soccer players, I mean, they probably have the most running under their belt. If you look at all the sports that are out there, all of the popular sports, at least. So yeah, those are all really great points. So you said we want them to have some sort of baseline fitness, some sort of, walking consistency and strength training consistency. Let's just say, they just want to get down to the nitty gritty. How much can they run? How soon can they run? And how much? Like, what kind of guidelines are we going to give this person?
Ooh, seems like a loaded question.
Well, of course it is.
It's so different for each person. I would say, just to be consistent in that baseline time frame, probably 4 to 8 weeks, somewhere in there, and then looking to into a walk run program from there, where you're looking at another probably 8 to 12 weeks before you're really you're running the whole time. Is like your whole duration of the workout is running pretty much. Trying to accelerate that, I think maybe you get lucky, but if I were a betting man, you're probably gonna get into some hot water. That you're gonna take some time to work around, and I don't know.
No, I think that's
my initial thought there.
I think that's extremely smart and probably the way that I would advise someone as well. But just like recap real quick, so to clarify, you're saying basically like 2 months or so of general strength and fit, like walking and strength stuff, and then basically 2 to 3 months of a walk run program. Yeah. And then, so we basically have almost half a year before somebody is continuous running. Let's say like 3 times a week.
Yeah, seems reasonable.
Okay, so I guarantee you that, honestly, if somebody is listening to this and has done that, something similar to that, reach out to us. We're going to give you some sort of virtual kudos, because that is like seriously, kudos to you, because I don't know if, what?
That absolutely, yes.
Because I don't know if anybody, I don't think I know of anybody personally who's taken an approach like that, starting running. Everybody it's like literally, like I said before, it's like roll out of bed, wake up, and you're like, I want to be a runner, and just like gung ho, like I want to be a runner. And they usually start running, and then they get an injury. And that's kind of maybe one of these contributing factors. I mean, there's a lot of factors there, but as to why the injury rates are so high, but with especially new runners. But it really does seem like the sport that you can just throw on a pair of shorts and shoes or whatever and just go out the door and do it. But it does require a lot of, a strategy and process, I think. So, we don't have to linger on this too long, but.
Yeah. So I don't even remember when this came to mind, but it was when I really started to shift my mindset to more of a long game rather than trying to get the 90-day fitness fix kind of thing. If you started your first day of cross country in high school as a freshman and you ran 1 mile that whole week and you added on 1 mile each week, when you come into your sophomore year, you're up to 50 miles. You took that whole year to build up. I still feel like 50 miles in a year is probably a lot. but it just kind of hits home, like when you look at the long term, for your own health and safety.
Mm-hmm. Totally. Yeah. So let's just talk about real quick in the same scenario before we move on. So we have, let's just say, a runner who's finished almost a half a year of doing exactly what you're telling them to, and they're running three to 4 times a week, continuously. And now they're asking, when can I start running 4 to 5 times a week consistently, maybe 6 times a week? And then when can I start running longer, right? Maybe they're like, I want to do a half marathon or a marathon. So like, I need to be able to run for a longer period of time. And then they're like, all my friends are doing these cool workouts. So when can I add in intensity? So when it comes to like weekly frequency, how many times per week you're running, how long these runs are, and then how intense you're running, like how might someone progress through that? Briefly, I know that's super complicated, but like just laying some ground rule fundamentals here.
Yeah, absolutely. Really, if you ran 3 times a week, you can get a whole lot done.
Totally, yeah.
I think the last few years, maybe 4, I've really only run 3, maybe 4 days a week at most. And I gotta tell you, I've been able to get just as fit as I was in college, running 6-7 days a week. So I'm not one to really push the frequency a ton once we get to the 3 to 4 days a week. But of course, if somebody has been running a long time, and I guess that's not really a new runner, so that's we'll talk about that in a little bit.
Yeah.
But yeah, if that was a big desire for them, I'd probably look at a full, a full season worth, like roughly 3 months of 3 to 4 days a week before we start layering in kind of that 5th day, just to make sure we're truly recovering well between runs.
Yeah,
there was more to that question, wasn't there, Matt?
Yeah, well, I mean, when we're talking a frequency per week of running and the 3 time a week rule thing or whatever, I totally agree with that. And when in doubt, you can stick to 3 times a week and do a lot. And just a really quick example of that is I had some issues with some injuries a couple years ago, and I wanted to train for my second time running the Never Summer 100K. And so it's 64 miles with like 13,000 feet of climbing in rugged wilderness. And so it's a pretty big deal. And I didn't feel like I could tolerate more than 3 times a week of running. I made sure I got my long run in on the weekend, and the other 2 days of the week, I did as much as I could, but I trained for 10 weeks, 3 times a week, and took 2 hours off my Never Summer 100K time, which, just to put that in perspective, the first year I think I did it in just under 19 hours, and then I did it in just under 17 hours this time that I'm referring to. And so like I you don't have to stress out on increasing your kind of frequency per week. I wasn't doing any intensity either. So I pretty much knew that I needed that duration factor for sure to run my ultra. And that's what I focused on. And you can just get a lot done. But yeah. Let's just say somebody.
Now, were you doing anything else other than running those 3 days?
No, not at the time.
Okay. Well, that's a better example than me, because I usually am biking on the days I'm not running, and then, lifting a couple times a week. So that's definitely a caveat I always add on. But maybe I'll use you as an example now.
Yeah, seriously. Cause I know you're like, I can't run, I'm going to cycle. And like, from a heart and lungs perspective right now, for example, you've been, fighting this injury for a while that you may talk about in a little bit, but, you're probably fairly fit. Now, how much of that fitness is specific to running and will translate completely to running is another question. But in terms of you being able to exercise your heart and lungs, you do a lot of, cycling and stuff like that when you can't run. Whereas at the time, I wasn't doing that. Really. And I was probably mountain biking a little bit for fun and cycling a little bit here and there, but I guarantee you I wasn't really doing a whole ton of cross training.
Gotcha.
But yeah, so real quick in terms of you were talking about frequency, so then adding duration, I mean, whenever people think about adding duration or just training volume in general, there's like that 10% rule. What do you feel about? How do you feel about that?
It's all right, I guess. It doesn't. I don't think it tends to lend itself too well to the beginning runner or anybody on kind of a more lower volume program. I mean, if you run 20 miles a week, which is a fair amount, I mean, you're not going to increase by 2 miles. Like, what is that really that much of a change to elicit any type of adaptation, positively or negatively? I don't think so. But if you're running, probably 60 plus miles a week, now we're talking like 5 to 10 miles change, maybe then. But even then, there's, in those runners, there's probably a lot of intensity layered into things and some other variables, we need to be mindful of than just looking at volume.
Totally. I like to think, I wish there was a better equation for taking into consideration other factors, but there just isn't. I mean, obviously we want everything as objective as possible, in your scenario, having a shorter distance track background, you have folks layering more workouts throughout the week, and there's just more factors there. And then from my perspective, I have a lot of trail and ultra runners who, I did a run the other day. It was only like 10 and a half miles or whatever it was. And it took me like almost 3 hours because it was steep, technical, and at altitude. You know what I mean? Like those are all factors that are going to wear down on me. Somebody goes and runs Long's Peak, like we were talking about earlier. I feel blasted after I run Long's Peak. And that's because it is highly technical. It's super high altitude. And if I just treat that as a 14-mile run, period, it is so much different than a flat 14-mile run, because it's a 14-mile run, but you can't compare them like that. So 10% of this is not 10% of that, and there's too many factors. So I think if there are a lot of other factors are controlled for, 10% or whatever percent might work okay, depending on the case. But yeah, that's my thought. Those are my thoughts.
Yeah. So when might you look to layer in more duration?
So I think we should at least signal the fact that we're probably moving more so into the category of like away from somebody who's like brand new. I mean, this definitely is applicable. This is definitely applicable to, but all the listeners who are like, are they still talking about somebody who is a brand new runner? I think we're moving on from there. So we're talking more so just about general progression of a healthy runner now. If a runner is like, I'm running 30 miles a week and I want to do more, what should I do? If we're just talking about volume, I'm going to ask them about their goals. I'm going to ask them about what are they training for. If they're training for like a sky running series race, the mileage may not matter a whole ton, and getting them on steep terrain more frequently is going to be more important. But then if we have somebody who is like training for they want to run a somewhat flat, not super technical ultra, like a 50K or a 50 mile, we're gonna try and push the needle in the direction of getting them on their feet longer, period, on not so technical terrain. So then we can kind of not have to worry a whole ton about the technical running aspect and getting a ton of vert, because that can muddy the equation significantly, is this concept of just cumulative ascent and descent. Just the fact that intensity is always a little higher on the ascent, and then on the descent we have more muscle damage and fatigue, and with the eccentric stress, and so there's all those factors. But just kind of blabbing because there is no real answer. It just depends on the person. I would have them increase. I would try to control for as many other factors as possible. And depending on how they're feeling, I would increase a couple of weeks. And then if we notice that they're feeling fatigued or their performance is decreasing a little bit, we would take a down week or take some time. It doesn't have to be a week. Take some time to deload and see if we get some sort of compensation after a rest period. where they feel great, they feel better, and then they perform better after that, and we can ramp up again from there. I mean, that's just very general, but like, I mean, does that answer your question?
I think I would ask them, so you're doing XYZ right now. How are you feeling with that amount of training? Like, do you feel like it would be a reasonable step for you to do a little bit more? Like, and just see where that conversation takes you.
Yeah, that's huge, actually. And I don't know if I got this from you, because I did peek at your coaching intake form before I created mine, but there is a question on my personal run coaching intake form where they lay out all of their training, like basically what's a typical current training week for them. And then below that, it says, like, how do you feel about your current training load? And it says either like it's too easy, like super manageable, like too easy. Like it's almost like the Goldilocks. Yeah, it's like Goldilocks question. So it's like, it's too easy, it's just right, or it's like too much. And most people, I've never had somebody say they're doing too much, but pretty much all of my clients have said either they can do more, which is why they're looking for a coach, because they don't know how they should do more, or it's just right and they're looking to optimize what they're doing. So I think that plays a huge role.
Yeah, 100%.
Cool.
So then what about intensity? I think would be the next.
Yeah. So I want to preface this with the fact that, I think my biggest confidence deficit going into starting personal run coaching when I did was the whole deal, the prescribing and layering and intensity component. And that's why I had consulted with you initially that one time and needed to get on a call with you before, lay some, just to talk about all of it. And I feel so much more confident now, but I try to learn all the time, especially in this category. But what I've realized, the more I learn, is that the simpler it is, especially in the beginning, the simpler it is, the better. I think that someone obviously needs enough tissue capacity to be able to do higher intensity work. And so you are going to basically be asking, somebody, how do you feel in terms of your current, like similar question to before, as before, but like if somebody's complaining of a lot of these little niggles and stuff like that, you're not going to want that person to start layering in intensity, especially if those areas of discomfort are in the like at the level of the calf or the Achilles tendon, stuff like that. So like I do have on occasion people complaining of that as well once they start layering in intensity. And that's when you're like, well, our progression needs to take a little bit of a detour, because we do not want to just set somebody, on a course for some sort of tendinopathy or bone stress injury or anything like that. But I like to start, but I'm beating around the bush. I like to start somebody with just a couple of strides and ask them, how do they feel with that? And that's like my first gauge as to like, has this person ever run at that fast? And then how do they feel about it? And if, they might be like, that was fun and that felt great and it felt good. And, you do that a couple of times, and then you can layer in like longer efforts that are maybe not as intense. But it just depends. But I think that in general, you have this concept of time at intensity. And, I guess the rule of thumb is to kind of aim around that like 15-minute mark, right? Of
20, yeah.
Yeah, 15, 20. And we can not during this podcast get into like a lot of Steven Seiler's work and basically that 88 to 92% of someone's max heart rate and blah, 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 blah. But basically you want somebody running fairly hard for, at least like 15 minutes. And so that's typically where I'll start somebody, and we can split that up however, they're going to tolerate it best to start with. It doesn't necessarily matter a whole ton how. You could do 3x5, you could do 4x4, and just see how they feel, and then kind of go from there. I mean, those are just some general ideas. Like, what do you say?
Yeah, I think certainly, I think when I would start to bring up that conversation is when they start feeling comfortable with like 30 to 40 minutes of running. So similar to if somebody's, looking to get into running or looking to return from an injury or something, which we'll touch on more in a little bit here, but looking for, just like we would look for that like 30 to 45 minutes of being able to walk briskly with no symptoms. I want people, before we layer intensity, probably 30, 40 minutes of being able to run comfortably. That way I know we can layer in some more intensity there, and they should be able to tolerate that pretty well. As opposed to, when you're starting out running or getting back into it, the fitness isn't there for that. You might be running at a high intensity just as your baseline. And to layer in more intensity doesn't really make sense.
Totally. Yeah, I agree with that for sure. Should we move? So I mean, from an order perspective, do you think that it matters a whole ton to address kind of how many runs per week versus how long they're running versus the intensity? Because we talk about this a lot as frequency, then duration, then intensity. I mean, it's going to vary from individual to individual, but I mean, as a general rule of thumb, how do you kind of lay that out in the landscape?
Yeah, I think frequency is biggest, just trying to, over a period of time, layer in that stimulus more frequently to stimulate adaptation, as opposed to doing everything you do in a week, like in one day, and then expecting the same result. It doesn't really, work that way. And most likely that's going to work against you more than anything. So from there, then layer in the duration. And then once you tolerate, a pretty good amount of duration within that frequency, then we start layering in that intensity.
Yep. So before we go into talking about injuries and stuff, I think, and adding that to the equation, because then the conversation changes dramatically. But I think it's important for people to just understand that the body is really adaptable, and me and you both, our philosophies from a training perspective and a rehab perspective are based around this fact that the body is really adaptable. But the body, so what that means basically is that the body will adapt to try and compensate for a stress or a lack of stress. And so if you are just running the same thing over and over, like you said, the body's not going to adapt. And so there needs to be a challenge to the body. And especially when it comes into that layering in the intensity, especially, is that we're trying to leave this homeostasis and get uncomfortable because we know the body can adapt to that. And then same with duration as well. Like we want to run at a length of time and spend a certain amount of time running that our body isn't quite used to. So it creates adaptations in order to make it better at doing that. And so if you're not progressing certain factors and variables in your training, it's not likely you're going to see a whole ton of progress.
Yeah. And that progress is going to take some time.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, you can't rush that.
People get frustrated. They're working out for a month and, they don't see much change. We write training programs for 12 to 16 weeks, for a reason. Give or take, based on the individual, the time goal, or distance goal if it's more in the ultra world, maybe. Because it just takes time. You can't cheat the physiology.
Nope, there's nothing on the market either. There's nothing magic out there. So the most magical thing that you can do is get some good sleep, manage your stress, have good nutrition, and proper training progression.
That is, unless you want to get into the like illegal performance enhancement direction. But if that's the case, we're probably not the people you want to be working with.
That's a different market, I think. But yeah,
fair enough.
That's a different market, the black market. No. So yeah. Anyway, let's move on. Let's talk about like adding in this factor of being injured, right? So you're a good example. You're an experienced runner. You've been dealing with a pretty significant injury over the last couple of months. And like, why don't you just shed a little bit of light as to what kind of return to running program you're doing for yourself?
Yeah, so it's been actually a little bit of two things that I had going on. Initially, it was my left ankle, and I managed that beautifully, and felt like I was good to go after about 3 weeks. Then we went on this really great hike up here in the Springs and had quite a bit of climbing. It was like 7 miles total, and I was just beat up the next day. But I was thinking I'd go for a run because, we just did a hike. It would be no big deal. And I almost thought, you know what, I'm not going to run today. That was the smart coaching in me. But my dog, he needed to get out, release some energy. And
blame it on the dog.
Of course. He got me out there, and it seemed okay, but I definitely noticed left side was good. Right side, something was a little like funky. I was like, I'm really sore. I'm good. A couple days later, I got another run, and the next day it was like, nope. I did something crossed the threshold of what was acceptable for my body at that time. And since then, I did not manage this one quite nearly as good. Kind of just picked up where I left off on the left ankle. And, that was probably a little too much for the initial going. I need to scale back some more. So I would say, it wasn't necessarily that I did anything wrong on paper. Everything was pretty logical. It was a nice loading progression. I think I was only running like 3 days a week at the time, only like 2-3 miles. But as good as it looked on paper, I wasn't really being self-honest with how I was truly responding to it. And I ended up kind of yo-yoing every time I'd run. It'd be just a little bit too much or a little too soon. And I wasn't, instead of starting at like 100%, I was really at like 90% or somewhere in there. And then, and then I started getting nervous about my fitness. Now we're looking at, a month, 6 weeks or so, to where I was like, I was getting nervous about it. Like, I wasn't really accepting the fact that things truly needed to change. I think there's a lot of self-honesty that has to happen when we have some pain or injury to really navigate that safely and not prolong it any longer than it needs to, such as what I had done here. And so I tried to layer in just a very, very subtle progression into my runs, which, if you listen to this from the start, you realize that I layered in intensity before the duration and even some of the frequency. Mm-hmm. So needless to say, that didn't really work out. Now we're on 2 days of running, and for the last couple weeks, and I've responded so much better. Just accepted the fact that fitness isn't going to be there. That is okay. It will come back once we're on the other end of this. And I've just done so much better. Scaled the runs back more to doing and switching to time intervals, which I think is also key. Just to take out any expectation of mileage, expectation of pacing, and just run casually for that duration. And it's so much easier, at least for me, to wrap my head around like, oh, I'm going to run 2 or 3 minutes longer. Like that's okay. But to run, if I was going to run 2 miles and then now I'm going to run 2.25 miles, that seems ridiculous. But it would translate to be almost the same thing, so that's what I've been doing. That's where I'm at.
You had
last couple of years or last couple of weeks, it's been a lot better.
So you had like 2 injuries, right? Because you had the first one, it was kind of like a niggle that you managed that in some way. You had an onset of pain. And then I want to know how did you view that pain? Like, how did you know how much to do over those 3 weeks to get you back to kind of where you needed to be in 3 weeks? And then how does that differ from the pain that you were feeling, the response you were getting, which you kind of touched on, but like, I want to know more so about what was injured that you, right? And your case is a little different than somebody who might be listening, who might have to go to a healthcare professional and figure this out, right? But you can like pretty much figure it out on your own for the most part in most cases. So like, what's going on, what is it? And then how does that combined with the pain response and the pain behavior, how did that guide your judgment with moving your running forward?
Yeah, that's super important to understand for the listeners, because I was 99% sure that it was a tendon on the inside of my ankle, and it seemed to, it just felt on a very localized level, like thicker or more fuller. I don't want to use the word swollen, because like you couldn't see anything around it. You couldn't palpate any like swelling or like a bogginess, or that's a term some people might use. But it felt like it like on a deep level. And that the day that preceded that was a day that I had done quite a bit of climbing. Around it actually, the total amount of climbing wasn't that much, but it was over the course of 6 miles of a 9-mile run, and then got in another run with the dog again. Because I'd fallen that day like a half mile into the run, and it was supposed to be a big loop where I would pick him up and then run back to the car for a couple miles. But since I fell and like scraped up my hands really bad, we ended up going back to the car, coming home, cleaned up a little bit, and then improvised the route. And anyway, did a little too much that day, and felt like the tendons were a little irritated, and having them feeling like a bit swollen. Oh no, I just said I didn't want to use the term swollen. They were full. Just the sensation that there was more tissue there than normal, which would indicate kind of a reactive state of a tendon where that it does build up some fluid to help build that cross-sectional area to decrease the amount of stress or load on that tendon. So I basically scaled back for like 2 or 3 days and didn't do any running, any impacts, and just like really, really easy, short cycling just to kind of pump blood and nourishment to it. And then I did like a 2-mile run, then waited a couple days, did a 4-mile run, a couple days, 6-mile run, and that was a little too much, scaled back to 4. And I stayed up there for a few runs, and then ramped back up. And then it was like good to go, like in 2 or 3 weeks or so. So that differs greatly. Or do you have a question there?
How much pain did you have during some of those runs? And like, how did you said that you hit a point of too much at one point. So like, if you had pain throughout the process, like what's too much? How'd you know that?
So honestly, there really wasn't much pain at all. I could just tell that something wasn't right.
Okay.
And then when I had that moment, I ramped up to 6, I had that initial feeling as I did the first day again. There was more of that. So it was load dependent. And then scaled back again, just let it kind of be exposed for a longer period of time to what I knew it could accept and tolerate, and then progressed again.
I mean, how do you know it's tolerating it? Like, what is that? What defines that?
Gotcha. So felt good during, immediately after, and then the next day. And I think especially next day is probably most important for a tendon, as far as pain or whatever symptom you're having with that. I think that's the biggest component, because they are kind of slow responders, and you just don't know right away, especially with their warm-up phenomenon. It can feel good during your session, but then not so good, the next day when you wake up.
So the day you ran 6 miles and that was too much, how did you know it was too much? What did you feel?
Absolutely nothing. Felt great until the next day when I woke up, and then I had that same feeling of more
fullness.
That fullness kind of feeling. Yeah, something that's like super weird, not normal for me at all.
So then that situation is a little bit different, maybe, because you're using these other non-pain descriptors to define the tolerability of your tendon. But
I utilize the same principles. It was just a different symptom with it.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I think it's important to. That's a great point for sure, because a lot of us just we just think about pain, and there's other symptoms for sure. But yeah, during, after, the next day, and kind of looking at it. I tell folks sometimes, like the traffic light example. It's like green light, yellow light, red light. If pain is increasing during, depending on how much, that's probably yellow light, and it could be a red light, right? And depending on what it is. But for a tendon, that might be okay, but we tend to see those warm up. So you might feel it during, and then it'll feel a little bit better. But even if it feels better during, afterwards it can feel worse, and then the next day it can feel worse. And depending on how bad it gets, how much worse it gets after and the next day, it could be a yellow light or a red light situation. But typically you want it to return back to baseline within 24, no more than like 36 hours or so. And if you're trying to test it out every other day or so, with that kind of rule of thumb, by the time next time you're going to run, it should be completely back to baseline for sure, because it's 48 hours. So I think that's kind of a good rule of thumb for a lot of folks. And I don't want folks to take this advice and just roll with it, but like it needs to be individualized for sure. Because if you take this advice and you put it on somebody who's maybe got a bone stress injury, you're going to have a completely different result. Because tendons need this load. We need to stress the tissue with the issue, but bones need to rest and recover and heal, right? So have you ever had a bone stress injury?
I have, actually.
Okay, so you can speak a bit more of this than I can, but like, explain real quick, what is the difference? If AJ's saying pain is okay as long as like we know what it is and like it's returning to baseline and it's not getting so bad during or after, which we might have to define that here in a minute. But like, what is too bad? What's pain that's too bad? But what's the difference between like if it's a tendon or a bone?
I think the biggest difference is with a tendon, we're probably talking about more tissue sensitivity to the amount of stress we put on it, as opposed to truly having a tissue damage, what I might consider more of an injury related problem as opposed to a pain related problem. Whereas with that bone stress injury, there is actual fracturing of it. In the case of a stress fracture, God forbid something worse, if you were to utilize those same principles we would use for a tendon and not give it time to heal before going into that loading progression to help strengthen that bone back up.
Yeah. So what might be some of let's talk real quick. So let's just say somebody's got a tendon related issue. What are some things that you might have them look out for? Something you might tell one of your patients who's returning to running after an injury and trying to progress their running after an injury? What are some signs that maybe point to just them doing too much or there being too much pain or too much pushing of the tissue in its current state?
So an increase of symptoms would be kind of the biggest piece there.
But like in the moment, after?
Oh, gotcha. So with a tendon, it's probably actually going to feel better. Maybe not initially, but it'll warm and have this warm up phenomenon. Feel better during, and then I generally tell people during and then kind of the next day. If I am in the session with them, I might be interested in kind of immediately after, because sometimes people be like, yeah, it feels fine, or it's a mild or level we're okay with working with, and then afterwards it's like, oh, now it's like really bothering me, and then like, okay, wait, I don't even need to know what the next day response is. That was too much. Whereas with a bone stress injury, I really want it pain free completely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally.
Pretty much a hard rule for me.
Yeah. So touching all the bases you touched. I usually tell folks, and the pain scale sucks, 0 to 10 or whatever, what's your pain, it sucks. And I think that most people tend to do okay without it. I think there might've been a study, I think I saw Tom Goom post it like a long time ago or something, but that this definition of what's an acceptable level of pain versus an unacceptable level of pain is just as good as using the pain scale. So people don't like numbers, and especially if someone's like a nurse and they come in and they're like, oh God, I hate this scale. And it's like, okay, well, let's just not use it. Or sometimes I'll use both. I'll give them both examples, and I'll say, if like 10 is the worst pain you can ever imagine, and like 1 is barely detectable, where might you be at baseline, and just like set a baseline, and then, what might be a significant increase from there. But in most scenarios, we kind of don't want to see folks trending past that like 4 or 5 mark all that often. But that's going to vary from person to person. And you just can't take somebody's word for it when they're like, oh, I have a high pain tolerance. Like that means nothing to me. I hear that all the time. And it's more of this like concept of acceptable versus unacceptable. So what might define unacceptable? I usually just tell folks, if you're altering your mechanics in any way, shape, or form, especially during your running, like if you're running, you're altering your running mechanics, that's a red flag there. If you finish running and your pain is so increased that it's now affecting your activities of daily living at home and doing normal things, and it wasn't at baseline, that's probably an unacceptable level. And then if that pain doesn't return to a baseline within a reasonable amount of time, that like 24 to 36 hour window, that's probably an unacceptable response as well. That does not mean stop, okay? Especially if it's like a tendon, if it's non-bone, it doesn't mean stop. It just means modify. That's a huge concept too, because I have folks who go home from the eval and they're like, PT is inherently diagnostically a lot of provocative tests. And so you have people who may go home that, a little bit heightened from a pain response. And then they're like, oh, well, those exercises may be worse. And then I see them a week later and they're like, I haven't done any exercises and I haven't done any walk runs since I saw you because I got worse after that one. And it's like, oh no, like we just, we lost out on a week. There are so many factors we can modify to make things more tolerable for you and stay within an acceptable amount of pain. And, this could be a whole podcast in and of itself talking about pain, but like a lot of the time pain is okay. And pain is sometimes a validation that we're stressing tissues that need to respond and adapt. So pain is okay. We just need to lay some ground rules and have people understand as part of the process. We just need to know where what's too much. But then when it comes to bone stress injuries, we don't want any pain. We want that bone to heal. There's risks associated, varying depending on where, how bad it is and where it is, but we need the bone to heal, and we need it to do so in a completely pain-free manner. So there's a huge difference there.
Yeah, I've moved more to, instead of 0 to 10, it's like just mild, moderate, severe. Mild, we green light it. Moderate, here are the variables you can play with. Have at it. have, just have free will there, and just let me know how it goes if you're in that scenario. If it's more severe, aka like this is really not acceptable for you to be tolerating for whatever reason, then we're pulling the plug. Then let's go ahead and let's stop. But I also want you to contact me because we need to reevaluate things at that point.
Totally. Yeah. So going back to like the progression from being injured perspective, just what approach, have you, like, because you've incorporated some different strategies of walking and running and stuff, like what types of strategies might you done or might you do with a patient who you're trying to just build their tolerance to return to running? Like, what might that look like?
I think so. We first establish what they were doing previously, and we work to trying to build towards that frequency. And outside of that, maybe we just start twice a week, maybe it's 3 times, depending on kind of their symptom severity. And we kind of see how they respond. I think general rule, if you do 2, maybe 3 weeks at most on the conservative side at the same level, and you continue to respond really well, then we try to add in, another day. Or if you're already at your previous frequency, then let's try to add in some more duration there. Other than that, a whole lot of walking. There have been a couple of times where I've come back from an injury, and those times I was both walking a ton for a couple of different reasons, and I felt the best like going back into running. Like I wasn't as sore. I wasn't, I just seemed to like pick it up a whole lot faster than other times where I maybe only biked or something.
Yeah. I think walking, walking is so overlooked by so many runners when they're injured, and they're just like, oh, I'll aqua jog or swim or cycle or whatever. But the reality is, like, the closest thing we have to running is fast walking. And a lot of times I tell folks too, I'm like, walking takes priority over some of these other things, depending on their schedule, depending on how much they can fit in. But like, typically you have an injured runner and they were dedicating a certain number of hours per week to running, and now they can't dedicate all those hours to running, and so we know they have the time. So it's like, let's take some of that time and dedicate it to the process. And cycling is going to be great for your heart and lungs, just kind of like what we talked about with you earlier. But cycling is not building tissue capacity, and cycling is not from a joint range of motion perspective or impact forces or kind of energy storage and release perspective. It's not similar really at all to running. And so maybe you have to work on some of these things to build tissue capacity. And so walking has a huge place, and it should take priority. And then just one more concept with walking is, some folks are like, when can I run? When can I run? The reality is you should be able to walk before you can run. If you can't tolerate walking, you're probably not going to tolerate running. So let's start with a walk and do a lot of it and see how you do.
Yeah, you can run when you can run.
Yeah, totally. And so is it safe to say that, like, you might take a typical walk run program that you would give a newbie runner and give something similar to an injured runner, depending on the situation?
I think they look pretty similar. It's maybe just a little accelerated.
Yeah, I think so too. And tell me what you think about this, but obviously it depends on the person. But this is also something I think I got from Tom Goom, but he has that like rule of 2s or whatever, where if you have 2 consecutive runs, you can progress to the next, you could progress your some sort of running variable. So that's typically, for folks who have some sort of stable progression with a return to running from an injury, I think that works. But there are individuals where they need a much longer kind of steady approach. And it's just dependent on how they feel on a given day or week. I mean, do you have anything to add in terms of that approach?
I think so. It sounds reasonable.
Yeah. So, I have one guy right now coming back from kind of low back, kind of hip thing. And he's been doing 3 runs a week, just progressing 1 walk run level every week. I had a gal who was she's been yo-yoing through the walk run stuff for like months. And now she's finally continuous running. So it just depends. It depends how long you're off too. Cause sometimes I'll pick somebody up who's injured and they're like, I haven't been running in 3 months. And then sometimes I get somebody who's like, I haven't been running in 2 weeks. And those are different, and especially different than I haven't run in 6 months or a year. So it just depends. But it's just a very similar approach. We've laid all the groundwork and fundamentals. It's just that they change on a person-to-person basis.
Yeah.
Did you want to add anything? What else did we miss?
I think I'd just like to highlight the self-honesty piece again. You're where you're at. It doesn't matter how good things look on paper, how pretty the progression is. It is where it is, and it responds how it responds. You're ultimately kind of no longer in charge to an extent. That sensitive tissue is what's in charge, and you're reacting to that and progressing based on its response.
Totally. Yeah, I think that's great. You have to be patient. You have to do this right. You can't just rest it off. That's one. So the progression has to happen to some capacity. If you're having trouble with establishing that, in general, I think, obviously I'm going to advocate for us in being healthcare running specialists, but like, that's important. You have to have a progression. And then the other factor is, you're only, like Chris, I'm going to quote Chris Johnson, you're only as good as your last injury and how well you've rehabbed it. So injuries, like the runners get stuck in this injury cycle. Everybody has that runner, or maybe you're that runner, or everybody knows that runner, I should say, or has a friend that is just stuck in this cycle of being injured over and over again because they just do too much too soon, they come back too quickly or whatever, and they get re-injured. So I think that's a super important concept. You just got to own it, own your injury, and just take ownership and do the right thing and have the patience to just see it through to the end. Anyway.
Yeah. And I would say seek out help from somebody who really knows running, not just the runner, but really knows and understands the running. Because there's a difference between your general average clinician, the clinician who is a runner, and the clinician who really knows running. Now, a lot of times there's some overlap there, but it just takes it to a whole nother level when you can talk about somebody's training, talk about the progression back, talk about the injury piece, be able to attack the whole person and environment that runner is living in.
Totally. Any other closing remarks?
I think that was it.
Cool. I think that was a good end.
Yeah.
So if anybody has any questions they want to shoot to us, just email us at makingstridespodcast@gmail.com. All of this contact information, where to find us and all that stuff is going to be in the show notes. Otherwise, that's it. Peace out. Go make some strides.
Yeah. We'll see you guys.
Hey guys, I just wanted to take a quick minute here at the end to thank you for taking the time to listen to our podcast all the way to the end. If you learned anything from us today, or if you see the value in this podcast, please take a second to share your favorite episode on social media. Another way to show your support is to give us a review on iTunes or whatever podcast platform you're using. If you have any questions about anything you heard, please feel free to reach out to either of us via any of our social media channels. All of the information with how to connect with us, whether it's Facebook, Instagram, our websites, email, all that information will be listed at the bottom of the show notes. Lastly, as a thank you for your support, for anyone who mentions this podcast, you can receive $10 off any service to work with either Adam at Run Mental or me at Up and Running PT. First time clients only. Okay guys, have a great day.